Opening the king's diagonal instantly prepares for rapid queen and bishop development, asserting central influence. Immediately contesting the center with asymmetrical pawn structure promises an engaging, complex battle where control of key squares will be fiercely contested. Quickly developing a knight centralizes pressure and prepares for the pawn storm, setting the stage for a dynamic middle game. Developing the knight to c6 controls the d4 square, a typical Sicilian objective, and prepares further development. Immediately challenging the center opens a dynamic fight for space and piece activity. Black opens a diagonal for the queen and prepares to contest central control by relieving pawn tension. Reclaiming the pawn with the knight immediately opens diagonals and prepares for rapid piece development, aiming for central influence. Developing the knight here contests the center and prepares kingside castling, a sound response to white's central pawn push. Developing the knight here bolsters central control and prepares for castling, maintaining the tension in this Sicilian defense. Solidifying the center and preparing for the bishop development, this pawn push opens lines for future play. Placing the bishop on c4 actively targets black's kingside and prepares for an early kingside attack, while also maintaining flexible development for white's other pieces. Unleashing a calculated threat against white's weak b2 pawn, black immediately injects tactical urgency into the position, forcing white to address this inconvenient pressure. Retreating the knight from the pawn's immediate pressure allows it to redeploy for a more effective defensive posture, potentially targeting the c5 square or supporting a future pawn push on the kingside, while also avoiding a tactical exchange that might simplify the position prematurely and diminish white's attacking prospects. Solidifying the pawn chain now allows black to contest the d4 square more effectively and prepares for potential a6 and bb4 ideas, aiming to disrupt white's bishop placement. Securing the monarch is paramount, establishing a safe haven for the king and paving the way for potential pawn advancements in the center or queenside, while simultaneously preparing to connect the rooks for future action on open files. Solidifying the kingside structure, this bishop's relocation prepares for castling and also subtly influences the center by potentially eyeing the d4 pawn. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal, this move prepares to pressure black's queenside structure and potentially eye the weak f7 square. The queen repositions, seeking a safer harbor while subtly preparing for potential pawn pushes on the queenside. This relocation avoids immediate pressure from the bishop and maintains flexibility, though it slightly reduces the queen's influence on the central squares for now. Consider how this change affects potential breakthroughs for both sides. The queen's absence from a more active square could invite counterplay. Pushing the f-pawn aggressively secures more central space and prepares for a kingside pawn storm, though it does create a slight weakness on the dark squares around your own monarch. Safeguarding the monarch becomes the immediate priority as the king seeks the safety of castled quarters, a natural response to white's aggressive pawn push on the kingside. This maneuver also prepares for potential central pawn breaks and frees the rook for future action. Elevating the bishop to d3 strategically reorients white's queenside attack, creating a more active diagonal for the bishop and preparing to contest the crucial d-file. Securing a queenside foothold and preparing for potential pawn advances, this move creates a subtle, long-term structural advantage, even if its immediate impact is defensive. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, white boldly advances the g-pawn, aiming to pry open lines and create attacking chances against black's castled king. This aggressive pawn thrust signals an intention to exploit the slightly underdeveloped position of black's queenside pieces. While it creates immediate threats and potential attacking avenues, it also potentially weakens white's own king's safety and can lead to sharp, tactical complications if black can skillfully parry the onslaught and launch a counterattack. The success of this ambitious pawn push hinges on white's ability to follow through with subsequent attacking moves before black can consolidate and exploit the created weaknesses. Launching a bold queenside pawn thrust, black challenges white's kingside pawn storm and simultaneously aims to seize greater territorial control, creating intricate pawn chains that may dictate future play. Unleashing a pawn storm, white boldly probes the kingside, aiming to disrupt black's solid setup and potentially create mating threats with the advanced pawn. Embracing the knight's retreat to e8 is a fascinating decision, prioritizing safety and a potential counterstrike over immediate engagement, acknowledging the white king's growing presence on the kingside. This repositioning allows the knight to either f6 square or reroute to g7, bolstering the pawn chain and preparing for defensive maneuvers. It's a subtle way of saying, you may be advancing, but I'm building a solid wall and looking for weaknesses. Unleashing the queen towards the king's side, white aims to amplify pressure against black's relatively exposed monarch, eyeing potential mating nets that could develop from the g7 pawn's advance. Seeking to solidify the kingside attack, black aims to counter white's aggressive pawn advances by creating a stronger defensive structure. The queen's aggressive repositioning aims to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's castled king, creating immediate tactical threats and aiming to infiltrate the kingside. Black aggressively challenges white's kingside pawn storm by planting a pawn on f5, aiming to disrupt the attacking structure and potentially open lines for counterplay. This move, while seemingly creating immediate complications, introduces a significant pawn weakness on e6 if white can exploit the altered pawn chains. It also signals a shift in black's strategy from passive defense to active counteraggression, forcing white to reevaluate their attacking plans. The knight on e8 is now ideally placed to support this pawn thrust and potentially jump into the fight, but the overall king safety of both sides has become a paramount concern. Opening a crucial diagonal for your queen and threatening the weak pawn structure around black's king, this exchange liberates your piece and creates immediate pressure. Embracing the pawn storm's chaos, black recaptures, accepting the doubled f-pawns as a necessary evil to break open the kingside and disrupt white's attacking momentum before it can fully coalesce. This aggressive response opens lines and offers counterplay, aiming to exploit the exposed nature of white's monarch which, though seemingly safe behind its pawns, now faces the prospect of a sharp tactical battle. The immediate consequence is a fascinatingly unbalanced pawn structure, promising dynamic possibilities where material advantage might be secondary to the initiative and the creation of clear attacking chances for either side. Unleashing the knight to the center signals an immediate threat of disruption around black's castled king, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside pawns. Unleashing the knight from its stifled d-file position and preparing to bring it into the central fray, this maneuver simultaneously eyes potential weaknesses on the kingside and opens a crucial path for the bishop on c8 to participate in the battle. Asserting control over the central files, this deployment of the rook anticipates a potential struggle for dominance on the e file, simultaneously reinforcing the d-pawn and preparing for future pawn pushes that might involve the f file. The knight's retreat to g7 signifies a defensive maneuver, repositioning to safeguard the kingside while potentially redeploying to the f5 square if the opportunity arises, thereby influencing the center and the critical g-file. Initiating a rook's journey to the attacking flank, this maneuver aims to reinforce the g-file pressure and prepare for potential future advances like g6, or even a direct assault on the black king's shelter. This move aims to bring the rook into the attacking formation, increasing pressure on the kingside. It anticipates further pawn advances or piece activity on that wing. The knight's repositioning aims to bolster the kingside defense, a crucial endeavor given white's encroaching pawns and the exposed nature of black's monarch. By vacating the f6 square, it permits a potential retreat for the king should the central lines collapse or opens a path for further pawn pushes to counter white's aggressive buildup, though it does concede space and tempo in the short term. The queen's bold thrust to the fourth rank initiates a fascinating strategic battle, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside and potentially create mating threats. White's pieces are now dynamically positioned, with the queen actively participating in the central action and eyeing the kingside. This energetic placement demands black's immediate attention, as passive defense could prove disastrous. Consider the implications of this active queen, how it interacts with the pawn structure, and what defensive resources black must muster to neutralize white's aggressive intentions. The game is entering a phase where tactical sharpness and precise calculation will be paramount. Seeking to liberate the beleaguered knight from its defensive post, this maneuver aims to redeploy it to a more active square, potentially supporting a kingside counterplay or bolstering the central defense, even if it temporarily concedes space and allows the opponent's queen to dominate the 7th rank. Asserting control over the h-file with the rook's relocation opens a direct assault vector, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside structure black has inadvertently allowed to form. Unleashing a pawn storm is a bold choice here, creating immediate tension on the kingside and potentially opening lines, but it leaves your monarch alarmingly exposed to future attacks. Preparing to redeploy the bishop, this maneuver intends to activate the piece from its current passive post on c4, seeking better squares and potentially joining the kingside attack or reinforcing the queenside depending on the unfolding situation. Opening up the diagonal for the bishop with 22, and g6 injects some much-needed dynamism into black's position, as the knight on g7 was rather passive, and the potential for counterplay on the kingside is now slightly increased. Harnessing the queenside pressure, this repositioning of the queen seeks to exploit the weakened kingside dark squares and create a harmonious battery with the rook on the h-file, even if it means a slight loss of immediate attacking impetus. Exploiting the pin on the f-pawn, black lunges forward, seeking to unravel white's somewhat cramped queenside and open lines for counterplay. This advance aggressively challenges white's central control and attempts to force concessions before white can solidify their kingside attack. The knight's journey back to the queenside is a subtle maneuver, aiming to consolidate white's forces and prepare for a potential pawn storm on the kingside after the recent pawn thrusts. It also untangles the nc3 piece, potentially rerouting it to a more active square or supporting a central advance. This repositioning signals a shift from the initial aggressive kingside expansion towards a more solid, positional setup, ready to exploit any weaknesses black might have created in their own pawn structure. Black finally ignites the center, breaking the stalemate and creating immediate complications. This aggressive pawn thrust rips open the position, challenging white's central control and potentially unleashing dangerous attacking lines for black's pieces, particularly the bishop on e7, which has been looking for an active role. The ensuing pawn exchanges will likely define the character of the middle game and demand precise calculation from both sides, shifting the focus from white's kingside space grab to dynamic central counterplay. Finally, white breaks the pawn structure, creating immediate threats around black's castled king by opening lines and exposing weaknesses. A critical moment where material is exchanged, potentially unlocking the queen's diagonal, but at the cost of a temporarily weakened pawn structure around the king. The rook returns to its starting file, reasserting control and preparing to participate in the unfolding complications on the kingside. A critical repositioning now that the center has somewhat stabilized and black's pawn structure is visibly weakened. Sacrificing the exchange so early feels like a desperate gamble to unlock an attack on white's kingside, but it creates significant structural weaknesses on black's queenside and in the center. This audacious pawn grab rips open lines that white's pieces are already well positioned to exploit, especially the active rook on the 7th rank. By surrendering the rook, black essentially hopes for a swift mating net, but without that immediate, decisive strike, they are likely to find themselves overwhelmed by white's superior piece activity and the open lines leading towards their monarch. The bishop's centralizing advance shatters black's pawn chain, opening critical lines towards the exposed king and exploiting the weakened dark squares that resulted from the prior exchange sacrifice. A solidifying maneuver, the bishop retreats to a more robust defensive post, reinforcing the queenside and preparing to contribute to the center's eventual struggle, while simultaneously eyeing potential tactical nuances around white's aggressive pawn storm. A daring maneuver, aiming to exploit the now exposed king by opening the h-file, white sacrifices piece mobility for direct attacking potential. Focusing on the king's newfound activity, this maneuver bravely brings the monarch into the fray, aiming to support the beleaguered g-pawn and potentially exploit the open files that white has meticulously constructed. It's a daring gamble, potentially sacrificing structural integrity for dynamic counterplay, a stark contrast to the passive defense seen earlier. A bold repositioning of the queen, this square allows it to survey the d-file, potentially pressurizing the black king's defenses and also offering support for a future pawn push on the queen side, a dynamic shift that introduces new attacking possibilities. A bold attempt to unlock white's queenside and disrupt their kingside fortress by immediately challenging the bishop on e4, aiming to force exchanges and simplify into a potentially more favorable endgame, although it leaves the knight on d8 feeling quite exposed. The queen retreats, not out of fear, but to regroup and survey the unleashed storm on the kingside, hoping to find a calmer flank to exploit while the enemy king, though seemingly secure, now has an exposed pawn structure inviting a potential squeeze. A desperate attempt to untangle the pieces and introduce a sliver of counterplay through the now open g-file, but it leaves the king surprisingly exposed for now. Unleashing a rook sacrifice to rip open lines, white immediately targets the black king's exposed position and aims to exploit the weakened pawn shield that has formed. A bold sacrifice to rip open lines, aiming to exploit the exposed king at the heart of the enemy camp. Unleashing a forcing check now aims to shatter black's defensive structure, forcing the king into a precarious position and exploiting the exposed dark squares around it. The black king, now stripped of its pawn shield on the kingside, faces an onslaught. Its safety is entirely compromised by the exposed nature of its position, forcing a desperate retreat to the center to find any semblance of shelter amongst the remaining pieces. This forceful exchange finally opens lines towards the black king, a stark contrast to the pawn structure's earlier solidity. White sacrifices material for a devastatingly exposed monarch, a gamble that could prove brilliant or disastrous depending on black's immediate defensive capabilities. The diagonal now feels like a highway to victory, provided white can consolidate the advantage before black mobilizes their remaining forces. With the king exposed and centralized, black's immediate priority is desperately seeking refuge. Relocating the monarch towards the queen side, specifically to d7, offers a slim chance to escape the perpetual harassment and potential mating nets white is weaving. Initiating a subtle regrouping, this knight aims to improve its defensive posture and prepare for potential counterplay on the kingside, potentially supporting a future attack or simply avoiding further tactical skirmishes where it's currently exposed. Unleashing a desperate counterattack, black seeks to disrupt white's queenside dominance and disrupt the carefully constructed pawn structure. The unexpected capture with the knight immediately dissolves the previously built-up tension on the kingside, creating a starkly simplified position where the open files will now dictate the flow of the game. The black queen's bold plunge into the white camp, though seemingly aggressive, drastically simplifies the position, potentially leading to a disadvantageous endgame given white's material advantage and open king. Suddenly, white seeks to untangle their pieces and escape the immediate danger, aiming to reposition the knight to a more active square. Black's queen now dances back to safety, reclaiming a pawn and attempting to stabilize the position after white's aggressive king hunt. The material is now even, but white's pieces are remarkably active, particularly the rook on the 7th rank, and the knight on f2 has found a surprisingly solid defensive post. Black must find a way to untangle their pieces and activate their own rooks, which have been largely passive, or risk being slowly crushed by white's superior coordination and potentially exposed king. Unleashing a powerful discovered check, white forces the black king into further exposure, sacrificing a knight to dismantle the pawn shield and exploit the exposed king's desperate situation, aiming to simplify into a winning material advantage and a decisive attack. The king's exposed position on c6 now becomes a significant liability as the queenside collapses. Seizing the exposed queen, a tactical strike that clears the 6th rank and simplifies into a winning advantage, dictates the immediate future of this game. The black king, now exposed and adrift, desperately seeks sanctuary, but the active rook on g8 offers little respite, merely a potential target for further white aggression. The bishop's retreat opens a crucial diagonal for the queen, aiming to exploit the exposed black king and potentially create mating threats with coordinated piece pressure. Sacrificing the rook opens the g-file, forcing the white king into a precarious position and potentially creating attacking opportunities for the remaining black pieces. Securing the king's escape and preparing for potential checks are paramount after such a fierce exchange, preventing immediate tactical threats.